There is a particular kind of loneliness that does not announce itself loudly. It does not arrive when you are sitting alone in a quiet room or spending a Friday night by yourself. It arrives in a crowded space at a dinner table surrounded by laughter, in the middle of a conversation that feels hollow the moment it ends, or while scrolling through messages from people who technically know your name but have never once asked about your soul. This is the loneliness of someone who craves depth in a world that has learned to survive on the surface. And if you have ever felt it, you already know that it is one of the most quietly devastating experiences a human being can carry. What drives this hunger for deep connection is not weakness. It is not neediness in the way the world has taught you to be ashamed of. It is, at its core, one of the most fundamental truths of human psychology that we are wired for intimacy, for being truly known, and for knowing others in return. The psychologist John Cacioppo, who dedicated much of his life to studying loneliness, found that the pain of social disconnection activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. In other words, the ache you feel when a conversation stays shallow, when a friendship never deepens, when you leave a social gathering feeling more empty than when you arrived, that ache is not imagined. It is as real as any wound. So why does it feel so difficult to find what you are looking for? To understand that, we have to go back not to last year, not to your last failed friendship, but to the very beginning of how you learned to connect with people at all. Attachment theory, first developed by psychologist John Bowlby, tells us that the earliest bonds we form, usually with a primary caregiver, become the blueprint for every relationship that follows. If you grew up in an environment where emotional availability was consistent, where your feelings were met with curiosity rather than dismissal, where vulnerability was safe, you likely learned that deep connection is not only possible but expected. You enter adulthood believing, on some level, that people can be trusted with the real you. But for many people, that early environment looked different. Perhaps emotions were discouraged. Perhaps you learned that the only way to keep someone close was to be agreeable, easy, undemanding. Perhaps you watched the adults around you perform closeness without ever actually practicing it. And so you adapted. You became skilled at existing on the surface, even as something deep inside you quietly starved. This is where the craving begins, not as a romantic notion, but as a psychological response to early deprivation. The part of you that longs for someone to sit with your full story, to witness your contradictions without flinching, to love you not despite your complexity but because of it, that part of you is not asking for too much. That part of you is simply remembering what it always needed. The modern world, unfortunately, has not made this easier to find. We live in an era that has mastered the aesthetics of connection while hollowing out its substance. Social media gives us the performance of intimacy, curated highlights, reaction buttons, comment threads, without any of the discomfort that real closeness requires. Conversations have become transactions. Friendships are often maintained through memes and occasional check-ins rather than the slow, sometimes awkward, always necessary work of showing up for each other in the unglamorous moments. Even dating culture has shifted toward the quick evaluation, the surface-level compatibility check, the swiping of a human being's entire personhood into a yes or a no. In this environment, people who crave depth often begin to feel like they are fundamentally out of step with the world. You might find yourself walking away from social situations with a familiar exhaustion, not from being around people, but from the energy it takes to participate in exchanges that never quite reach you. You might find yourself oversharing with someone early on, not because you lack boundaries, but because some desperate part of you is testing the water, hoping they will lean in rather than pull back. You might find yourself cycling between intense closeness and painful distance in your relationships, never quite finding the equilibrium you are searching for. Psychologists identify this as anxious attachment and a constant, low-grade vigilance that involves scanning for signs of rejection, trying to earn depth through emotional labor, and mistaking intensity for intimacy. In others, the same unmet need for deep connection produces the opposite behavior, a kind of defensive withdrawal, an avoidant pattern where the longing for closeness is buried under layers of self-sufficiency. You tell yourself you do not need people, even as the need becomes louder and harder to silence. Both patterns, despite looking completely different from the outside, share the same root, a deep belief, often unconscious, that the full truth of who you are might be too much, or not enough, for someone else to hold. What makes this particularly painful is that the craving for deep connection is not just about wanting a best friend or a perfect partner. It is about wanting to be witnessed. There is something profoundly human about the need to have your inner life reflected back to you by another person, to say, "This is what I feel, this is what I have survived, this is what I secretly believe about the world," and to have someone look at you and say, "I see you. I understand. Me too." Without that experience of being witnessed, even the most successful, surrounded, socially active person can feel profoundly alone. And that loneliness, when it goes unnamed, has a way of shapeshifting into anxiety, into depression, into a persistent sense that something is wrong with you, when in fact, the only thing wrong is that a fundamental human need has gone unmet. But here is what is important to understand: the fact that you feel this longing so acutely is not a flaw. It is information. It is your inner self pointing, with remarkable consistency and clarity, toward what you need in order to truly thrive. The people who have lost touch with this craving, who have numbed themselves into accepting shallow connections as sufficient, are not better off. They are simply further from themselves. The path forward begins not with finding the right people, but with becoming more honest about what you are looking for and why. It begins with examining the stories you carry about whether depth is safe, whether intimacy is worth the risk of rejection, whether you are the kind of person someone could genuinely want to know. Many of those stories were written for you by circumstances you did not choose. They are not facts. They are old adaptations, survival strategies that once protected you but now keep you at arm's length from the very thing you need. Healing looks like practicing vulnerability in small, intentional doses. It looks like staying in a conversation a little longer than feels comfortable, asking the question beneath the question, sharing something true about yourself and letting the discomfort of that visibility teach you that you can survive being seen. It looks like choosing quality over quantity in your relationships, releasing the pressure to be socially everywhere and instead investing your emotional energy in the connections that have the potential to grow into something real. It looks like grieving the relationships that will never be what you need them to be, and making room for the ones that can. And perhaps most importantly, it looks like developing a deep and steady relationship with yourself, because the capacity to connect authentically with others is almost always proportional to the willingness to connect honestly with who you are. When you know yourself with kindness, when you can sit with your own complexity without judgment, you become far less dependent on others to validate your worth. And paradoxically, that groundedness makes true intimacy far more possible, because you are no longer asking another person to rescue you from yourself. You are simply inviting them to walk alongside you. You were never asking for too much. You were asking for something ancient and necessary. In a world that has traded depth for speed and intimacy for performance, the fact that you still hunger for something real is not a weakness to be managed. It is a compass pointing you home.